An old woman saves 3 orphaned bear cubs. You won't believe how they repay her kindness. In the heart of the untamed wilderness, where the biting cold silences everything and life clings to the edges of survival, an extraordinary bond was forged. It's a story of courage, compassion, and an unshakable connection between a solitary woman and 3 orphaned bear cubs. What began as a simple act of kindness would evolve into a tale so unbelievable it challenges everything we think we know about the wild. But how far would these bears go to repay the woman who saved them? And what secrets do the shadows of the forest hold? Before we dive into this incredible journey of loyalty, survival, and the power of nature, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stay with us because you won't want to miss the twists and heart-stirring moments that await. Let's begin. The sun rose sluggishly over the northern Canadian wilderness, casting pale light onto a frozen world. Pines stood like sentinels under heavy layers of snow, their branches sagging from the weight of nature's artistry. The air carried the sharp, metallic bite of temperatures that could strip life from even the most resilient creatures. In the midst of this vast and unforgiving expanse, a modest cabin rested on the edge of the boreal forest near the northern shores of Lake Sanon. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, a fragile sign of life defying the brutal cold. Inside, Emma Turner moved with practiced efficiency. Her calloused hands, worn from years of labor, adjusted the iron grate of the wood stove. The crackle of burning birch filled the silence, offering both warmth and a faint sense of companionship. She glanced at the thermometer nailed to the wall, a relic from her late husband's workshop. The mercury sat frozen at -40 degrees, a testament to the ferocity of the night. Emma, now 76, had grown accustomed to isolation. After her husband Robert's passing 15 years ago, she had retreated to this cabin, far from the noise of modern life. It wasn't an escape so much as a return to the simplicity she and Robert had cherished. Solitude, she often thought, was not the absence of others but the presence of herself. She had learned to live in harmony with the land, drawing water from a nearby spring and relying on her small sled to haul firewood from the forest. The morning had started like any other, her routine as predictable as the seasons. But as she sat down with her tea, steeped from Labrador tea leaves she had foraged in autumn, a sound cut through the morning stillness. It was faint at first, barely more than a murmur carried on the icy wind. Emma set her cup down, her brow furrowing. The sound came again, a weak, high-pitched whimper, so out of place that it sent a shiver down her spine. Living here had taught her the language of the wild. She knew the barks of foxes, the distant howls of wolves, and the haunting cries of loons on the lake. But this sound was different, fragile and desperate, like a plea for help. Wrapping herself in a heavy parka lined with wolf fur, a gift from a Cree elder years ago, she stepped into the snow. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing the breath from her lungs, but she pressed forward, following the sound. The path to her storage shed was familiar, but today it felt endless. Each step was a struggle, her boots sinking into snow that reached her knees. The wind carried a mournful howl, as if it grieved the lives it had claimed in the wilderness. Finally, she reached the shed, its wooden door swollen from the frost. The whimpers grew louder, more urgent, as she pushed it open. Inside, in the dim light filtering through the frosted window, she saw them, 3 tiny bear cubs huddled together in a corner. Their black fur was matted with ice, and their small bodies trembled violently. Emma's breath caught in her throat. They couldn't have been more than a few months old, their round faces dominated by wide, terrified eyes. For a moment they stared at her, too weak to move but not too weak to fear her. Emma's mind raced. These were black bears, Ursus americanus. She had seen their tracks before, deeper in the forest, but never this close to her cabin. Where was their mother? The answer came to her with a pang of sorrow. She must have been killed, likely by poachers hunting for gallbladders, a prized ingredient in traditional medicine markets. Without her, these cubs had no chance of surviving the winter. Poor little souls, Emma whispered, her voice catching in the icy air. She knew the danger of what she was considering. Wild bears were not pets. Taking them in could disrupt their instincts and lead to disaster for them and for her. But as she looked into their pleading eyes, she felt an ache that went beyond logic. It was the same ache she had felt when Robert lay in his hospital bed, slipping away despite her prayers. "I can't just leave you," she murmured. Carefully, she stepped closer, kneeling slowly so as not to frighten them. She removed her scarf and laid it over their shivering bodies, her hands trembling from more than just the cold. One of the cubs, the smallest, whimpered and nuzzled closer to the others, its tiny form barely moving. Emma returned to the cabin, her sled laden with blankets and a small pot of goat's milk warmed over the stove. It was a temporary solution. She knew she couldn't keep them forever. Her plan was to nurse them back to health and find a wildlife sanctuary that could take them in come spring. For now, they needed warmth, food, and hope, 3 things she could give them. That evening, the cabin felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. The cubs, whom Emma had named Theo, Lila, and Milo, huddled in a box near the stove. She watched them with a mixture of wonder and trepidation, marveling at their tiny paws and the way they pressed against each other for comfort. When Theo lifted his head to look at her, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name, Emma felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost long ago, purpose. Outside, the wind howled and the temperature plunged further. But inside the cabin, the faint sounds of breathing, 3 small lives saved from the snow, brought a warmth no fire could provide. Emma sipped her tea, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done, but also strangely lightened by their presence. As she looked at the cubs, she whispered a promise to the night, a vow carried on the crackling of the fire. "I'll do my best for you, whatever it takes." The days that followed were a delicate dance of survival and connection. Emma Turner, once accustomed to the stillness of her solitary life, now moved to a rhythm dictated by the fragile lives she had taken under her care. The black bear cubs, Theo, Lila, and Milo, had brought a strange energy to the cabin. It was as if the wilderness itself had crept into her home, wild and raw, but also full of an unspoken trust. The first night was the hardest. Emma had placed the cubs in a large wooden box lined with blankets, positioning it near the stove. The smallest cub, Milo, had whimpered through the night, his tiny voice trembling with a fear that tugged at Emma's heart. She had spent hours beside the box, whispering soothing words that felt awkward at first but became instinctive as the hours passed. She told them stories of Robert, of how he used to whistle when he chopped firewood, of the time he built her this cabin with his own hands. It was nonsense, of course. Bears didn't understand words. But Emma spoke because it filled the silence. And, somehow, it seemed to comfort them. By morning, the 3 cubs had managed to drink a little of the goat's milk she offered, though their inexperience with the bottle made it a messy process. Theo, the largest of the 3, lapped at the milk cautiously before nudging his siblings as if urging them to try. Lila followed hesitantly, her round eyes darting between Emma and the bottle. Milo needed the most coaxing, his fragile body trembling with every attempt. Emma found herself marveling at their tiny pink tongues and the soft pads of their paws, already roughened by the harshness of the forest. As the sun rose higher, Emma bundled herself in layers of wool and fur, preparing to face the bitter cold. The cubs, though recovering, were far from strong. They needed more than milk and warmth, they needed sustenance that would help them grow. Grabbing her old rifle, a relic of Robert's hunting days, Emma stepped out into the snow. Her breath fogged the air as she trudged toward the stream half a mile from the cabin, the ice groaning beneath her boots. Fishing had always been a necessity in this remote life. With practiced hands, she cut through the ice, the sharp blade of her auger biting into the frozen water. Minutes later, she sat silently, the line in her hand trembling with the current below. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it a sense of foreboding and wonder. Emma's thoughts wandered to the cubs in her cabin, their tiny forms curled together like fragile pieces of the wilderness itself. The line jerked suddenly, pulling Emma from her reverie. She reeled in her catch, a silver pike, its body glistening like frost in the pale sunlight. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. She caught two more before retreating to the warmth of her home, her cheeks stinging from the cold. Back at the cabin, the cubs greeted her return with faint, curious whimpers. Emma knelt by the stove, her hands deftly cleaning and preparing the fish. She boiled the meat into a soft, flaky consistency, mixing it with the milk to create a warm mash. The cubs sniffed tentatively at the offering, their small noses twitching. Theo was the first to eat, his tiny jaws working with surprising determination. Lila followed quickly, while Milo required Emma's gentle encouragement. For the first time, Emma saw something shift in their eyes, a flicker of life that had been absent before. Their movements became less lethargic, their breaths steadier. Emma couldn't help but smile as Theo let out a tiny growl, a sound so comical in its attempt at fierceness that it drew a soft laugh from her lips. "You've got some spirit, little one," she said, her voice warm despite the lingering chill in the air. Over the next week, the cubs began to explore their small world. They wobbled on unsteady legs, sniffing at the rough wooden floors and batting at the edges of their blankets. Lila, curious and bold, climbed out of the box one afternoon, her tiny claws scraping against the wood. She toddled over to Emma, who was mending a tear in her coat by the fire. The cub pressed her wet nose against Emma's hand, her eyes filled with an innocent wonder that caught Emma off guard. For a moment, the boundary between species seemed to dissolve. "You're a brave one," Emma murmured, stroking the cub's fur. It was coarse yet soft beneath her fingers, a reminder of their wildness and vulnerability. The days settled into a rhythm of care and observation. Emma's mornings were spent gathering fish and chopping wood, her afternoons feeding and tending to the cubs, and her evenings watching them as they played or curled together in sleep. She found herself marveling at their individual personalities. Theo, ever the protector, often placed himself between his siblings and anything new. Lila, adventurous and spirited, was always the first to investigate. Milo, though small and shy, had a quiet determination that shone through when he thought no one was watching. Emma couldn't explain the bond she felt with them. It was deeper than pity, stronger than curiosity. Perhaps it was their helplessness that mirrored her own sense of isolation. Or perhaps it was the simple act of giving, a reminder that even in the starkest winters, warmth could be found in acts of care. One evening, as the wind howled against the cabin walls and the fire cast flickering shadows, Emma sat with a book in her lap. The cubs slept soundly in their box, their soft breaths rising and falling in unison. She watched them for a long time, her thoughts drifting to Robert, to the life they had shared and the emptiness that had followed his passing. "I think you'd like them," she whispered to the memory of her husband, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "They remind me of us in a way, a little wild, a little lost." The cubs stirred slightly, their tiny forms shifting in sleep. Emma closed her book and leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing on her lips. For the first time in years, the silence of the wilderness didn't feel so heavy. It felt alive, filled with the sound of breathing, the flicker of hope, and the promise of something she couldn't yet name. The night deepened, and the stars outside burned cold and bright, bearing witness to the fragile beginnings of an extraordinary connection. The heart of winter bore down on the wilderness, each day colder and more relentless than the last. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, muffling the world outside into an eerie silence. The frost crept across the windows in delicate patterns, like veins of a frozen heart. Inside, Emma Turner and her 3 small charges pressed forward, navigating the fragile balance of survival in a world where nature never forgave mistakes. Emma's days had taken on a slow, deliberate rhythm, each task woven into the fabric of the cub's needs. She found herself rising earlier than usual, her joints protesting the chill as she stoked the fire. Each morning began with her pulling on layers of wool and fur to venture outside, gathering the resources that kept her tiny household alive. The goats needed feeding, the firewood pile checked, and most pressing of all, fresh fish caught from the icy stream. It was on one such morning, under a dull gray sky heavy with snow, that Emma noticed Theo watching her intently. The cub had grown stronger in the weeks since she had found him, his once frail body now holding a quiet sturdiness, though he was still small enough to fit easily in her arms. As she slipped on her boots, he padded to the door, his dark eyes questioning. "You can't come with me, little one," Emma said, kneeling to his level. She gently touched his coarse fur, warmed by the stove's heat. "It's too cold, and the ice is no place for you." Theo tilted his head, letting out a soft huff as though unconvinced. Emma chuckled despite herself, the sound strange in the stillness of the morning. "Stay with your siblings. I'll be back before you know it." The cub didn't follow as she stepped outside, but when Emma glanced back, she saw him sitting by the window, his small form silhouetted against the frost-covered glass. The sight tugged at her heart. How quickly she had grown attached to them, these tiny creatures who relied so completely on her. It was both a comfort and a weight she hadn't realized she needed. The stream was a lifeline in the dead of winter, though its bounty came at a cost. The journey there was grueling, each step through the deep snow a reminder of the wilderness' unforgiving nature. Emma's sled, laden with tools and supplies, creaked under the strain of the path. The air was so cold that her breath froze in small clouds, falling back onto her scarf like fine frost. When she reached the stream, she knelt to clear the hole she had cut days earlier. The ice had thickened overnight, its surface smooth and unbroken. She worked methodically, her gloved hands gripping the handle of her auger as she carved through the frozen layer. The effort sent sharp pains through her shoulders, but she pushed on, knowing there was no alternative. Without the fish, there would be no sustenance for the cubs or herself. As the auger broke through, the sound of rushing water reached her ears. Emma exhaled a sigh of relief, her breath visible in the frigid air. She baited her line and let it drop into the black water below, her fingers trembling slightly from the cold. Minutes passed, the silence interrupted only by the occasional groan of the ice beneath her knees. Her patience was rewarded with a sharp tug on the line. Emma reeled it in slowly, her movements precise. A large pike broke the surface, its scales gleaming like silver in the pale light. She worked quickly, adding the fish to her sled before casting the line again. By the time she had caught 3, her hands had grown numb despite her thick gloves. On the journey back, the wind picked up, blowing loose snow into her face. Emma pulled her hood tighter, her thoughts turning to the cubs waiting at home. The image of Theo by the window returned to her, his eyes dark and steady. There was something in his gaze she couldn't quite place, something almost human in its understanding. When she pushed open the cabin door, the warmth inside enveloped her like an embrace. The cubs stirred at her return, their small noses twitching at the scent of fresh fish. Theo was the first to approach, his cautious steps growing bolder as he recognized her. Lila and Milo followed, their excitement tempered by their lingering shyness. "You've been waiting, haven't you?" Emma said, her voice soft. She knelt down, letting Theo sniff her gloved hand before he nuzzled it gently. His fur felt warm and alive beneath her touch, a stark contrast to the lifeless cold outside. Emma set to work cleaning the fish, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The cubs watched her intently, their eyes following every movement. When she placed a small dish of cooked flakes in front of them, Theo dove in first, his tiny jaws working eagerly. Lila and Milo soon joined, their quiet growls of contentment filling the room as they ate. Emma sat back in her chair, her hands cradling a cup of tea. The warmth spread through her, chasing away the cold that had settled in her bones. She watched the cubs, a faint smile tugging at her lips. In their small, instinctive actions, she saw echoes of a life beyond survival, a life of connection, of trust. That evening, as the fire crackled low and the cubs curled together in their box, Emma reached for her journal. It was an old habit, one she had let slip in the years after Robert's passing. The pages were worn, filled with sketches and notes about the land, the seasons, and the creatures that shared her world. Tonight, she wrote about the cubs, the way Theo's eyes seemed to hold questions, the way Lila's curiosity pushed her to explore, the way Milo's quiet resilience shone through in his smallest movements. "They are not like anything I've ever known," she wrote, her pen moving slowly across the page. "They are wild and yet something more. Perhaps it is simply my loneliness that draws me to them, or perhaps it is the hand of something greater. Either way, they have given me a reason to rise each day, a reason to face this endless winter." She closed the journal, her fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Inside, the cubs slept peacefully, their small bodies rising and falling in unison. Emma leaned back in her chair, her gaze resting on the fire. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something she had almost forgotten, hope. The night deepened, and the stars outside burned cold and distant. But within the tiny cabin, a quiet warmth persisted, a testament to the bonds forming between an old woman and 3 wild hearts. The days crept forward, marked by the slow rhythm of the wilderness and the quiet transformations happening within Emma's cabin. The cubs, Theo, Lila, and Milo, were growing quickly. Their small, wobbly steps gave way to confident strides, their tiny claws scratching against the wooden floors as they explored every corner of their confined world. Emma watched them with a mixture of wonder and quiet apprehension. Every new milestone they reached filled her with pride, but it also brought a growing awareness of the inevitable. These were wild creatures, born to roam the vast forests and carve their lives among the trees, not to linger forever within the walls of her small home. She had always known this, but as winter wore on, the thought settled into her chest like a cold weight. One morning, as pale sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, Emma prepared the cubs' breakfast. The routine had become second nature to her, cooking their fish, mixing it with softened oats to provide the nourishment they needed to grow strong. But as she ladled the mixture into their bowls, she noticed something different. Theo, the largest and boldest of the three, no longer waited by the stove as he had before. Instead, he lingered by the door, his nose pressed against the bottom edge, sniffing the cold air that seeped through the cracks. Emma set the bowls on the floor and watched. Theo hesitated, glancing back at his siblings, who had already begun to eat. When neither Lila nor Milo joined him, Theo turned back to the door, his ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. "You're restless, aren't you?" Emma said softly. She knelt beside him, her knees protesting the motion, and placed a hand gently on his back. His fur was thick and warm, a testament to the health he had gained under her care. He didn't flinch at her touch but continued to stare at the door, his eyes dark and unfathomable. Lila and Milo, too, were beginning to change. Lila's boundless curiosity had turned toward the window. She would stand on her hind legs, her small paws pressed against the glass, peering out at the snowy expanse beyond. Milo, ever the quiet one, seemed more content to stay close to Emma, but even he had moments of unexplained agitation, pacing in tight circles as if he couldn't quite settle. The days grew longer as winter began its slow retreat. The snow softened, and the air carried the faintest promise of spring. Emma knew the time was approaching. She had done everything she could for the cubs, nursed them back to health, taught them to eat solid food, given them a safe place to grow. But their world was bigger than her cabin, and she had no right to keep them from it. One afternoon, Emma decided to prepare for their eventual departure. She bundled up and stepped outside, the soft crunch of melting snow beneath her boots. She had built a small enclosure near the edge of the forest, its wooden fencing sturdy but open enough for the cubs to climb if they chose to leave. It was meant to ease the transition, a halfway point between the safety of her care and the untamed wildness that awaited them. Theo, ever curious, followed her outside. He trotted through the snow with surprising grace, his black fur gleaming in the sunlight. When they reached the enclosure, he sniffed at the fence, then at the ground, his nose twitching with the sense of the earth beneath the snow. Emma watched him, her heart heavy. She had grown so used to his presence, the way he tilted his head when she spoke, the soft huffs he made when he was impatient. Letting go felt like losing a piece of herself. As if sensing her thoughts, Theo turned and looked at her. His gaze was steady, unblinking, filled with a calm she couldn't explain. It was as if he was reassuring her in his own way, telling her that this was how it was meant to be. "You're ready, aren't you?" she whispered. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "You've always been ready." The first time Emma left the cubs in the enclosure overnight, the silence in the cabin was deafening. She had grown so accustomed to their presence, the soft rustling of their movements, the occasional growls and huffs as they played. Without them, the cabin felt empty in a way that even years of solitude had never made it feel. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with worry. Would they be warm enough? Would they understand that the fence wasn't meant to keep them in, only to keep danger out? She had placed fresh fish and water in the enclosure, but would it be enough? The questions swirled endlessly until exhaustion claimed her. When morning came, Emma hurried outside, her breath catching in her throat as she approached the enclosure. She found all three cubs huddled together near the gate, their small bodies pressed close for warmth. Over the weeks that followed, Emma left them in the enclosure more often, gradually extending their time away from the cabin. Each time, it became a little easier, though the ache in her chest never fully faded. She watched as they explored the world beyond the fence, Theo leading the way, with Lila close behind and Milo following cautiously but steadily. They climbed trees, dug into the softening snow, and even began to chase after small creatures that darted through the underbrush. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and violet, Emma stood at the edge of the enclosure. The cubs were playing together, their movements fluid and full of life. She leaned against the fence, her hands gripping the rough wood, and let herself smile. "I won't hold you back," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the forest. "When you're ready to leave, you'll go, and I'll let you." Theo paused, his ears twitching, and turned to look at her. For a moment their gazes met, and Emma felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. She had saved them, yes, but they had saved her too. In their presence, she had found purpose, connection, and a reminder of the resilience she thought she had lost. As darkness fell, Emma returned to the cabin, leaving the cubs to the wilderness that was becoming their home. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a beginning. The thaw came slowly, with winter loosening its grip on the wilderness inch by inch. Snow still clung stubbornly to the shadowed corners of the forest, but the air carried the earthy scent of damp soil, and the streams gurgled with the freedom of melted ice. The wilderness was stirring awake, and so were Theo, Lila, and Milo. Emma Turner had spent months preparing herself for this moment, though nothing could truly prepare her. The cubs had grown strong, too strong to be contained by the wooden enclosure she had built for them. Theo's shoulders were broad now, his once clumsy steps replaced by quiet confidence. Lila moved with a lithe grace, her curiosity boundless and her sharp claws well suited to scaling trees. Even Milo, who had always been the smallest and most hesitant, carried a quiet resilience in his movements. Emma watched them closely, her heart a mix of pride and ache. She had done what she could for them, given them food, warmth, and safety when the world had threatened to take it all away. But now, the forest was calling them back, louder than ever, and she knew she had to let them answer. The morning they left was like any other. The sun rose over the trees, spilling light onto the damp earth and casting long shadows over the cabin. Emma was chopping kindling by the side of the house, the rhythmic sound of her axe breaking the stillness. She hadn't expected anything unusual, though a part of her had felt the shift in the air, a restlessness she couldn't quite name. When she returned to the enclosure, it was empty. For a moment, Emma simply stood there, the quiet settling around her like a weight. The gate was still closed, but the cubs had climbed over the fence, leaving behind only faint impressions in the soft earth. Their scent lingered faintly in the air, but it was already fading, carried away by the breeze. Emma's chest tightened as she leaned against the wooden post. She had known this day would come. She had even hoped for it. But the reality of their absence hit her harder than she had expected. The enclosure that had once been filled with their movements and soft growls was now silent, lifeless. The space felt impossibly large and empty. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She let the words hang in the air, as though saying them out loud would make them easier to bear. It didn't. That evening, she sat alone by the fire, her knitting untouched in her lap. The silence inside the cabin was heavier than it had ever been. She thought about the cubs, Theo's steady gaze, Lila's playful energy, Milo's quiet determination. They had been her constant companions through the long winter, filling her days with purpose and her nights with warmth. Now, their absence echoed in every corner of the cabin. But as the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the wall, Emma reminded herself of something she had written in her journal weeks ago. They are not mine to keep. They are not mine to hold. They belong to the wild. It was a hard truth, but one she had known all along. The cubs were not pets, not children, not hers. They were wild creatures, and the forest was where they were meant to be. She had given them a chance to survive. But they had given her something greater, a reminder that even in the deepest solitude, connections could be forged. That life, no matter how wild or fleeting, was meant to be shared. Over the following days, Emma adjusted to the quiet. She returned to her routines, chopping wood, fishing at the stream, tending to her small vegetable garden. The forest was alive with the sounds of spring, and Emma listened for the cubs' familiar calls. But they were gone, their tracks already fading into the underbrush. One afternoon, as Emma walked the path to the stream, she noticed something strange. Near the edge of the forest, where the trees grew thick and the shadows deepened, she found a fresh claw mark etched into the bark of a pine. The mark was deep and deliberate, unmistakably left by a bear. Emma paused, her hand brushing over the grooves in the wood. She had seen claw marks before, but this one was different. It was recent, as if left there for her to find. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the forest, but there was no sign of Theo, Lila, or Milo. Only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of a jay broke the silence. Still, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were nearby, watching from the shadows. She touched the mark one last time before continuing on her way, her steps lighter than they had been in days. The weeks turned into months, and Emma settled back into her solitary life. But the forest was no longer the same. She began to notice small signs, broken branches, scattered fur, the occasional track in the soft earth. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were there. And each time she found one, Emma felt a quiet reassurance that the cubs hadn't forgotten her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Emma stood on her porch, cradling a cup of tea. The air was cool and filled with the earthy scent of spring. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of a bear's call carried through the trees. Emma smiled, her heart full. She didn't know if it was Theo, Lila, or Milo. But it didn't matter. They were out there, living as they were meant to. And that was enough. The night deepened, and the forest hummed with life. Emma stayed on the porch long after her tea had gone cold, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. She wasn't alone. Not really. The bonds she had formed with the cubs, fleeting though they were, had left an indelible mark. They had taught her that connection could be found even in the most unexpected places, and that letting go didn't mean losing. It meant trusting in the strength of what had been shared. The stars shone brightly above, their light filtering through the canopy of trees. And somewhere, in the vast expanse of the wilderness, 3 young bears roamed free, carrying with them the memory of a woman who had saved them. The warmth of summer brought life to the wilderness, turning the once frozen expanse into a tapestry of green and gold. The forest buzzed with activity, songbirds darted through the trees, squirrels scurried along branches, and the scent of wildflowers lingered in the air. For Emma Turner, the season brought a bittersweet serenity. The cubs had been gone for months, but the forest still held echoes of them in its quiet corners. And she found herself both comforted and longing. She spent her days tending to the garden, now alive with rows of carrots, beans, and potatoes. The rhythmic act of weeding and watering grounded her, though her mind often wandered to the cubs. She wondered how they were faring, whether they had grown strong enough to face the challenges of the wild. She didn't expect to see them again. She had told herself that many times. But some part of her, a small and stubborn hope, still listened for their calls. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in soft hues of lavender and orange, Emma was gathering the last of the day's harvest. The light was fading quickly, and the forest grew quieter with the approach of night. She carried her basket toward the cabin, her steps slow as she took in the stillness around her. Then she felt it, a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. It was the feeling of being watched, of not being alone. Emma paused, her heart quickening. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the edge of the forest. At first, she saw nothing but the shadows of trees stretching long and dark across the clearing. But then, in the dim light, she spotted movement. A large shape emerged from the underbrush, silent and deliberate. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him, Theo. He had grown even larger, his shoulders broad and powerful, his glossy black fur catching the last rays of sunlight. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his posture calm but watchful. Emma didn't move. She wasn't afraid. Theo's presence didn't carry the unpredictable tension of a wild animal, instead, it felt familiar, almost comforting. She set the basket down slowly, her hands steady despite the thudding of her heart. "Theo," she said softly, her voice barely carrying across the clearing. The bear tilted his head, his dark eyes fixed on her. For a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken understanding. Then, behind Theo, two smaller shapes appeared, Lila and Milo. They had grown, too, though their frames were leaner than Theo's. Lila's movements were quick and curious, while Milo hung back, his cautious nature unchanged. Emma felt a wave of emotion rise within her, too complex to name. She had imagined this moment so many times, but the reality of it was overwhelming. They hadn't forgotten her, despite the pull of the wild, despite the months that had passed, they had returned. Lila explored the edge of the garden, sniffing at the rows of vegetables but leaving them untouched. Milo stayed at a distance, his cautious gaze never leaving Emma. As night fell, Emma lit a lantern and placed it on the porch, its soft glow illuminating the clearing. She sat on the steps, her hands clasped in her lap, and watched as the bears moved in the shadows. They didn't seem in a hurry to leave, and for that, she was grateful. Eventually, Theo stood and let out a low, rumbling sound. Lila and Milo lifted their heads, their ears twitching at the signal. Emma knew what it meant. They were leaving. She rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate, and stepped down from the porch. "Take care of each other," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of quiet urgency. "Be safe." Theo looked at her one last time, his gaze steady and deep. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest, Lila and Milo following close behind. Emma stood there for a long time after they were gone, the lantern's light flickering in the cool night air. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the way they had been before. Emma felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet joy in knowing the bears were out there, living their lives as they were meant to. She didn't know if they would return again, but the thought didn't trouble her. Their visit had been enough, a reminder that the bonds forged in the deepest winter could withstand even the longest separation. One evening, as Emma sat by the fire, she opened her journal. She wrote about their visit, about Theo's calm strength, Lila's endless curiosity, and Milo's quiet resilience. She wrote about the way they had looked at her, not as a stranger, but as someone they had once called home. They have grown, she wrote, her pen moving steadily across the page, and so have I. Letting go is never easy, but sometimes, it's the only way to truly hold on. Outside, the forest hummed with life. Emma closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, her gaze resting on the flickering flame. The night was deep, and the stars burned brightly above, a testament to the enduring light of connections made, no matter how fleeting. The summer days turned to the golden hues of autumn, and with them came a subtle shift in the forest. The vibrant greens of the trees gave way to brilliant shades of amber and crimson, their leaves falling in quiet cascades to carpet the earth. The crisp air carried the scent of pine and the faint sweetness of decay, a reminder of the forest's eternal cycle of life and death. Emma moved through the familiar rhythms of her life, but the bear's visit lingered in her thoughts. Their return had stirred something deep within her, a sense of renewal, of having been part of something far greater than herself. Her journal filled with sketches of Theo's hulking form, Lila's playful energy, and Milo's watchful eyes. She carried their memory like a quiet song in her heart, one she hummed to herself when the nights grew long and the wind howled at her windows. One early autumn morning, Emma awoke to the sound of soft rustling outside her cabin. She lay still, listening. It was a familiar sound, not the careless noise of scavenging animals, but the deliberate movements of something larger. Her breath caught. Could it be them? She rose quickly, pulling on her shawl against the chill, and opened the cabin door. The forest was cloaked in a thin mist, the rising sun casting golden beams through the trees. At first, she saw nothing. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she spotted them. Theo stood at the edge of the clearing, his powerful frame unmistakable. Behind him were Lila and Milo, both larger than when she had last seen them. But this time, they were not alone. Two smaller shapes moved between them, tiny cubs, their fur still soft and their steps unsteady. Emma's hand flew to her mouth as she took in the sight. Theo and Lila had brought their own young, a new generation, born into the wild. For a moment, she could hardly breathe, her chest swelling with an overwhelming mixture of pride, wonder, and joy. She stepped down from the porch slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. The bears watched her, their dark eyes steady. The cubs, curious and unafraid, peeked out from behind their parents, their small noses twitching at the scent of the woman who had once saved their family. Emma knelt at the edge of the clearing, keeping a respectful distance. She didn't reach out, didn't call to them. She simply sat there, letting the moment wash over her. Theo stepped forward, his massive paw silent on the soft earth. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze locked on hers. Then, in a gesture that nearly brought tears to Emma's eyes, he dipped his head slightly as if in acknowledgement. It wasn't just a visit, it was a message. Theo and his family lingered in the clearing for a while, the cubs playing under the watchful eyes of their parents. Lila chased after the little ones as they tumbled through the leaves, her playful growls echoing softly. Milo, ever cautious, stayed at the periphery, his sharp eyes scanning the forest. Emma stayed with them until the sun climbed higher, its warmth melting the morning mist. When it was time for them to leave, Theo turned to her one last time. In his eyes, Emma saw something she couldn't quite explain, gratitude, perhaps, or recognition of the bond they shared. Then, he disappeared into the trees, the others following close behind. That evening, Emma sat by her fire, her journal open in her lap. She wrote slowly, her pen tracing words that felt both monumental and deeply personal. They have not forgotten. Their lives have moved forward as they should, but they carry the memory of kindness. And now, their young will carry it too. This is the gift of the wild, to be part of something endless, something greater than oneself. As the fire crackled and the stars blinked into view, Emma felt a profound sense of peace. The forest had given her a purpose when she thought she had none. The cubs had shown her that even in the deepest solitude, connections could be formed, and in letting go, those connections could grow stronger. Emma closed her journal and set it on the table. Outside, the forest was alive with the hum of crickets and the distant calls of owls. She stepped onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders, and looked out into the darkness. "I'll always be here," she whispered, her words carried by the cool night air, "for as long as you need me." The stars burned brightly above, their light unwavering. And somewhere in the vast wilderness, Theo, Lila, Milo, and their young roamed free, carrying the memory of the woman who had once saved them. In the quiet of her cabin, Emma smiled. She was not alone, not really. The forest had become her family, and in its endless cycles of life and connection, she had found her place. Years later, visitors to the area would speak of the old woman who lived alone in the woods. They would tell stories of the bears who seemed to guard her, who left claw marks near her cabin and were often seen lingering at the forest's edge. Wildlife researchers, intrigued by the tales, would document the unusual behavior of these black bears, noting their apparent bond with the woman who had once saved them. But for Emma Turner, it was never about the attention or the curiosity of others. It was about the quiet truth she had come to understand, that kindness, even in its simplest form, has the power to transcend boundaries and ripple outward in ways we cannot predict. And so, the forest thrived, and Emma thrived within it. Her life, once solitary and quiet, became a part of the wilderness' endless story, a story of resilience, connection, and the unyielding strength of kindness. And so, in the heart of the wilderness, an extraordinary story unfolded, a testament to the power of kindness and the bonds that can form across species. From saving 3 helpless cubs to witnessing their incredible acts of gratitude, Emma's journey reminds us all that compassion can ripple far beyond what we ever imagine. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the beauty of connection, make sure to like, comment, and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales like this one. Together, let's celebrate stories that warm the soul and remind us of the magic that exists in our world. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.